I liked the alien woman and invited her to dance, but she turned out to be a vampire queen. Captain Leon Cross had attended exactly 47 mandatory diplomatic functions in his career, and he'd hated every single one of them with the kind of pure, refined loathing usually reserved for traffic violations and lukewarm coffee. This particular gala, hosted aboard Concordia Station in the neutral zone between the Terran Federation and approximately 99 other interstellar powers who couldn't agree on what constituted proper breakfast food, was shaping up to be number 48 on his list of cosmic injustices. The grand ballroom stretched before him like a glittering nightmare of forced socialization. Chandeliers constructed from harvested comet ice refracted light into thousands of dancing spectrums across marble floors that had been imported inexplicably from a moon of Jupiter. The acoustics were perfect, which meant Leon could hear every single conversation he didn't want to participate in. Mercurian delegates floated past, their holographic skins cycling through polite greeting patterns. A cluster of Titan folk stood near the western colonnade, their gravity boots leaving hairline cracks in the expensive flooring that some poor maintenance crew would curse about later. Somewhere in the middle distance, an ambassador from the singing worlds was attempting to explain musical democracy to a very confused trade representative from New Kyoto. Leon had positioned himself with tactical precision near the refreshment table, armed with a glass of something that claimed to be champagne, but tasted more like regret fermented in starlight. His dress uniform itched in places he couldn't scratch without causing a diplomatic incident. The collar was too tight. His shoes, polished to military specifications, were slowly murdering his feet. He'd tried to call in sick, but his commanding officer had reminded him that general ennui wasn't recognized by the medical corps as a valid excuse, and also that attending these functions was part of his duty as captain of the diplomatic escort vessel, Reasonable Doubt. The name of his ship had seemed funny when he'd first taken command. Now it felt prophetic. He watched the crowd swirl and eddy like a particularly well-dressed particle accelerator. There was Ambassador Takral, whose species communicated primarily through scent and who was making everyone within 3 meters extremely uncomfortable. The Andromedean delegation had arrived in matching silver suits that hurt to look at directly. Someone had brought a pet that might have been a dog, or possibly a small, sentient nebula. Leon wasn't entirely sure and didn't want to ask. The orchestra, composed of musicians from 6 different worlds, was doing their best to find a rhythm that wouldn't offend anyone's cultural sensibilities, which resulted in something that sounded like a waltz having an argument with a quantum uncertainty principle. Leon took another sip of his terrible champagne and contemplated the mathematical probability of a convenient asteroid strike. He'd been here for 43 minutes. The gala was scheduled to last another 3 hours. He did the math. It wasn't encouraging. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Rivera, had escaped this particular circle of hell by volunteering for double shifts on the ship. Leon was making a mental note to be significantly less generous with shore leave approvals when his gaze snagged on someone across the ballroom. She stood near one of the viewing ports, where the infinite darkness of space pressed against transparent aluminum like a held breath. The starlight seemed to bend around her, or maybe that was just the champagne talking. Her skin was blue, not the pale blue of oxygen deprivation that would require immediate medical attention, but a deep, luminous sapphire that seemed to hold its own light. Her gown was the color of a moonless night, flowing around her like liquid shadow, like someone had captured the concept of midnight and convinced it to behave as fabric. The pointed tips of her ears were just visible through hair that cascaded past her shoulders in waves of darkness touched with hints of violet. What struck Leon most wasn't her appearance. Concordia Station hosted beings of every conceivable shape and biochemistry, but her stillness. Everyone else in the ballroom was in motion, networking and politicking and performing the elaborate dance of interstellar relations. She simply stood, observing, separate from the current of bodies and conversation. There was something in her isolation that resonated with his own desperate desire to be anywhere else. She watched the crowd with the detached interest of a scientist studying an experiment, or possibly a predator deciding whether the effort of hunting was worth the calorie expenditure. Leon noticed something else. The crowd flowed around her like water around a stone, maintaining a careful distance without seeming to realize they were doing it. Guests would approach within 3 meters and then veer away, suddenly remembering urgent conversations they needed to have elsewhere. A Plutonian dignitary had been heading straight for her position, and then abruptly changed course, nearly colliding with a floating drink tray piloted by a service drone. Warning bells should have been ringing in Leon's head. Alarm klaxons. Possibly an entire orchestra of danger signals. Instead, what he felt was curiosity, and the kind of reckless impulse that had gotten him through flight school, 3 combat tours, and one spectacularly inadvisable relationship with a cargo hauler captain who'd stolen his favorite jacket. He set down his champagne glass, checked that his uniform was properly arranged, and started across the ballroom floor. His feet carried him forward through clusters of delegates and past the Andromedean delegation's blinding suits. A small voice in the back of his mind suggested this was a terrible idea. Leon told that voice to shut up. He'd been having terrible ideas his entire life. They'd worked out fine. Well, mostly fine. Fine enough. The walk across the ballroom felt longer than the time Leon had piloted through the Deneb asteroid field with failing engines and a navigation computer that kept insisting they were actually in someone's kitchen. Each step brought him closer to the blue-skinned woman, and each step gave him more opportunity to reconsider his life choices. A waiter drone zipped past carrying a tray of something that glowed faintly green and probably violated several health codes. Leon sidestepped it without breaking stride. He was committed now. Turning back would look worse than whatever awkward interaction awaited him. This was the logic he'd used before jumping his ship through an unstable wormhole last year, and he'd survived that, so really how bad could this be? As he drew closer, more details crystallized. Her gown wasn't just dark, it seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a subtle shadow that had no business existing under the ballroom's aggressive illumination. The pointed ears that rose from her hair were delicate, almost translucent at the tips, with a slight curve that reminded him of ancient Earth illustrations he'd seen in a museum once. Her fingers, wrapped around a wine glass she hadn't sipped from, were long and elegant, the nails shaped to subtle points. She stood with perfect posture, the kind that suggested either military training or royalty, or possibly both, which Leon filed away under. Things that should probably concern me more than they do. He was 5 meters away when a Jovian minister almost backed directly into his path, gesticulating wildly about tariff regulations. Leon ducked, narrowly avoiding an elbow to the face. 3 meters. A couple swirled past in an enthusiastic interpretation of whatever the orchestra was attempting. 2 meters. The woman's eyes were still fixed on the crowd, tracking movement with an intensity that made Leon think of the big cats he'd seen on a nature preserve once, right before feeding time. 1 meter. Leon cleared his throat, which came out sounding slightly strangled. Professional. Very professional. He extended his hand in what he hoped was a universally recognized gesture of non-hostility and social invitation, rather than some horrible insult that would get him ejected into space. Would you like to dance? She turned to face him fully for the first time, and Leon's brain momentarily forgot how to process visual information. Her eyes were extraordinary, deep violet with flecks of silver that seemed to move like distant stars, holding depths that suggested either profound wisdom or profound danger, or possibly both at the same time. They fixed on him with an intensity that made him feel like a biological sample under a very expensive microscope. Her expression remained neutral, unreadable, the kind of face that professional card players spent years trying to cultivate. The silence stretched. Leon's extended hand hung in the space between them, growing increasingly awkward. Somewhere behind him, the Andromedean delegation's suits reached a new frequency of painful brightness. The orchestra transitioned into something that might have been a Centaurian waltz or possibly a funeral dirge. Leon couldn't tell anymore. His entire universe had narrowed to this moment, this woman, and the growing certainty that he'd made a spectacular miscalculation. Then her lips curved into the smallest of smiles, barely a shift in expression, and she placed her hand in his. The touch sent a shock through Leon's nervous system. Her skin was cool, not cold exactly, but noticeably below human standard temperature. It felt like touching moonlight. if Moonlight had substance and could agree to dance with idiots at diplomatic functions. Her fingers closed around his with surprising strength, and Leon had the sudden visceral awareness that if she decided to crush every bone in his hand, there wasn't much he could do about it. "Bold," she said, her voice low and melodic with an accent Leon couldn't place, something that suggested she'd learned standard from someone who'd learned it from someone else. 3 or 4 iterations removed from any native speaker. The single word seemed to contain layers of meaning that Leon's champagne-addled brain couldn't fully parse. Was it a compliment? A warning? An observation about his questionable decision-making skills? "I try," Leon managed, his voice only slightly higher than normal. He gently tugged her hand, guiding them toward the dance floor, acutely aware that every eye in the ballroom was suddenly tracking their movement. The Jovian minister had stopped mid-gesture. The Plutonian dignitary had frozen with a canapé halfway to his mouth. Even the service drones seemed to hover in place, their simple programming unable to reconcile what they were witnessing. The crowd parted before them like a sea that really didn't want to get involved. Leon and his mysterious partner reached the center of the dance floor, and he moved into what he desperately hoped was the correct position for a Centaurian waltz. His hand found her waist, which felt like touching condensed night air wrapped in expensive fabric. She adjusted his grip with her free hand, a micro-correction that suggested he'd been approximately 60% wrong about proper form. "You dance beautifully," Leon said, because his mouth had apparently decided to continue operating independently of his survival instinct. She tilted her head, studying him like he was a particularly interesting puzzle. "I've had practice, several lifetimes worth." Leon laughed, a nervous sound that echoed too loud in the suddenly quiet ballroom. The orchestra, bless them, finally seemed to find their rhythm. "That's quite a commitment to learning the waltz. Most people give up after a few years." "Most people," she said, "don't have the luxury of time I possess." They began to move, and Leon immediately understood he was catastrophically outmatched. She flowed across the floor with a grace that defied physics, each step perfectly placed, her body moving through the dance like water following predetermined channels. Leon, who'd taken exactly 6 weeks of mandatory dance instruction at the academy and remembered maybe 3 of those lessons, stumbled almost immediately. His foot caught hers, or would have, except she'd already adjusted, shifting her weight in a way that turned his clumsy misstep into something that almost looked intentional. They spun across the polished marble, and Leon tried desperately to remember if the next step in a Centaurian waltz was left-right pivot or right-left regret all life choices. His partner seemed to anticipate every mistake before he made it, adjusting her movements to compensate for his complete lack of coordination. When he stepped too wide, she was already there, closing the gap. When he forgot to lead, which was constantly, she led instead, so smoothly that no one watching would notice the transition. "So," Leon said, because apparently his strategy for dealing with stress was to fill silence with words. "Do you come to these things often? The mandatory diplomatic galas, I mean. They're very sparkly." Her eyes, those impossible violet depths with their moving silver flecks, fixed on him with something that might have been amusement. "Occasionally, when circumstances require my presence. And you, Captain? You seem less than enthusiastic about the festivities." Leon's brain caught on something. "I didn't tell you my rank." "You're wearing it," she said, gesturing minutely to his uniform insignia with her chin. "And you carry yourself like someone accustomed to command. Also, you have that particular expression of resigned suffering common to military officers forced into formal social situations. Is it that obvious? You look like you're calculating the nearest escape route." "I was actually calculating the probability of a convenient asteroid strike," Leon admitted. The math wasn't encouraging. She laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a crystalline garden, brief and surprisingly genuine. The sound seemed to ripple through the ballroom, causing several nearby conversations to falter. The orchestra hit a crescendo, and she spun him, reversing their positions so smoothly that Leon didn't realize what happened until he was facing the opposite direction. Through the viewing port behind them, a small transport vessel drifted past Concordia Station, its running lights blinking in rhythmic patterns. "What brings you here?" Leon asked, trying to inject his voice with casual interest rather than desperate curiosity mixed with mounting anxiety. If you don't mind me asking, are you with one of the delegations? In a manner of speaking, she guided them through a series of steps that Leon was absolutely certain weren't part of any waltz he'd ever learned. I represent certain interests in this sector: trade negotiations, territorial agreements, the usual tedious necessities of maintaining peace between star systems that can barely agree on which direction constitutes up in zero gravity. Sounds thrilling. It's remarkably similar to watching stellar formation. Lots of pressure, excessive heat, and occasionally something explodes. Leon grinned despite himself. That's the best description of diplomatic relations I've ever heard. I'm stealing that from my reports. You're welcome to it. She executed a turn that should have tied them both in knots, but somehow resulted in perfect synchronization. Though I suspect your superiors might question your metaphor choices. They were attracting more attention now, not that they'd lacked for it before. A cluster of Martian officials had stopped their conversation entirely to watch. One of the Titan folk was recording the dance on some kind of ocular implant, the device glowing softly at his temple. Even the Andromedian delegation had dimmed their suits slightly, which Leon interpreted as either respect or possibly concern. The ballroom had developed a strange quality, as if the normal sounds of conversation and movement had been wrapped in cotton and pushed to the edges, leaving only the music and the soft sound of their feet against marble. I should probably know more about you, Leon ventured. Spinning her, or being spun by her, it was honestly hard to tell anymore. Since we're dancing and all, the social protocols probably require introductions. I'm Leon, Captain Leon Cross of the Terran Federation vessel Reasonable Doubt, which is currently docked at Bay 7, and which I would very much like to return to after this gala ends, if I survive that long. Survive? Her eyebrow arched, a gesture so precise it looked choreographed. Do you find diplomatic functions particularly dangerous? I find small talk potentially fatal. Also, I once saw someone start a minor war by using the wrong honorific. There are landmines everywhere in these conversations, and I have very large feet. You're managing adequately so far. That's the nicest thing anyone said to me all week. Leon attempted a dip, which his partner allowed with the kind of patience usually reserved for teaching small children not to eat paste. So, do I get to know your name? Or is this one of those mysterious anonymous dance situations where we part ways, and I spend the rest of my life wondering about the beautiful stranger at the gala? She studied him for a long moment, and Leon had the unsettling sensation of being assessed, measured, and filed away into some vast mental catalog. The music swelled around them, the orchestra finally hitting their stride with something that sounded almost intentional. Overhead, the comet ice chandeliers cast fractured rainbows across the dancers, and through the viewing ports, the stars wheeled slowly as Concordia Station maintained its rotation. Sarathis, she said finally, the name rolling off her tongue with a weight that seemed to press against Leon's eardrums. His feet continued moving, muscle memory and her guidance carrying him through the steps, while his brain frantically searched its databases. Sarathis. Why did that sound familiar? Where had he heard that name? His mental filing system, usually reliable despite the champagne, started pulling files. Diplomatic briefings, intelligence reports. That extremely boring 3-hour lecture on interspecies political structures that he'd attended while severely jet-lagged and possibly asleep for portions of it. The music swept them through another rotation, and Leon's gaze caught on her smile. It had widened slightly, revealing the edges of her teeth. Very white teeth. Very sharp teeth. Particularly the canines, which came to elegant points that caught the light like polished bone. Oh, hell. The pieces of information slammed together in Leon's mind with all the grace of a cargo freighter experiencing catastrophic engine failure. Sarathis, the Crimson Dominion, vampire monarchy, the Treaty of Red Stars where she'd negotiated peace by simply arriving and making everyone so profoundly uncomfortable that they'd signed whatever documents she pushed across the table. The shadow ships that moved through space-time using principles that made theoretical physicists weep and reconsider their career choices. The fleet that had pacified an entire rebel sector in 72 hours without firing a single shot, just by showing up and being terrifying. Queen Sarathis. He was dancing with Queen Sarathis, ruler of the Crimson Dominion, whose territory encompassed 17 star systems and whose reputation for ruthless efficiency was matched only by her reputation for being absolutely, categorically not someone you wanted to accidentally offend at a diplomatic function. Leon's feet, bless them, continued moving through the waltz pattern. His autonomic nervous system kept his heart beating and his lungs processing oxygen, even as his higher brain functions dissolved into something resembling static. Sarathis watched his face with obvious interest, those violet eyes tracking each micro-expression as realization cascaded through his consciousness like a particularly unpleasant waterfall. "I see you've remembered where you've heard my name," she said, her voice carrying that same thread of amusement that suggested she was enjoying this significantly more than he was. "Your Majesty," Leon managed, his voice coming out approximately 2 octaves higher than normal. I didn't realize. Protocol dictates that I should have bowed, observed proper forms of address, requested permission through appropriate diplomatic channels before presuming to invite me to dance." She tilted her head and the chandeliers caught the pointed tips of her ears. "Yes, technically, but where would be the entertainment in that?" "Entertainment," Leon repeated weakly. The ballroom had taken on a slightly surreal quality, as if he'd slipped sideways into an alternate dimension where he made spectacularly worse decisions than usual. "Right. Happy to provide entertainment. That's me, Captain Leon Cross, professional entertainer and apparently suicidal diplomat." "Not suicidal," Sarathis corrected, spinning him through a turn that his body executed while his mind was still several steps behind. "Merely unburdened by excessive caution. It's refreshing, actually. Most people approach me with such elaborate care, as if I might spontaneously combust or drain them dry if they use the wrong honorific." "I mean," Leon said, because his mouth had fully committed to getting him killed at this point, "is that off the table? The draining thing? Because I should mention, I have very thin blood, practically anemic. Multiple doctors have expressed concern. It's a whole medical situation." She laughed again, that crystalline sound that made the nearby Martian officials visibly flinch. "Your medical status is duly noted, Captain. I'll endeavor to contain my bloodthirsty impulses for the duration of our dance." "The duration being the next 30 seconds before I die of embarrassment?" "I was thinking more along the lines of the next 3 minutes until the orchestra finishes this piece. Unless you'd prefer to flee now, I would understand. Most would." Leon's pride, which had gotten him through flight school, 3 combat tours, and numerous situations where retreat would have been the sensible option, reared its stupid head. "I asked you to dance. Seems cowardly to bail halfway through just because I've discovered your terrifying royalty who could probably disassemble me at a molecular level. I appreciate the commitment to seeing things through." Sarathis guided them into a more complex pattern, something that involved footwork Leon was absolutely certain he'd never learned. His body followed anyway, moved by her lead and sheer desperate momentum. Though for the record, molecular disassembly isn't really my preferred method. Too messy. Creates awkward paperwork. "Good to know. What is your preferred method? Just so I can avoid triggering it accidentally." "Disappointment," she said, her expression grave. "I find it remarkably effective. Nothing wounds quite like knowing you've failed to meet expectations." Leon barked a laugh, surprising himself. "You know, for an ancient vampire queen who rules 17 star systems, you're pretty funny." 17 and a half, she corrected. "We're negotiating for the Kepler colonies. The paperwork is tedious." They swept past the viewing port, and Leon caught a glimpse of one of her shadow ships in the distance, a vessel that seemed to be made of folded darkness and geometric impossibilities. It drifted past the station like a shark circling prey, though whether the station or Leon himself was the prey remained unclear. The music built towards something that sounded like a climax, assuming the orchestra's various species had reached consensus on what constituted musical resolution. Around them, the other dancers had given up any pretense of not watching. The ballroom had essentially become a theater, with Leon and Sarathis as the main performance. He spotted Ambassador Takral in the crowd, whose scent-based communication was probably expressing something extremely judgmental. The Titan folk were all recording now, their ocular implants glowing like a constellation of concerned eyes. "So," Leon said, because he'd come this far and might as well commit fully to whatever this was, "do you actually drink blood, or is that more of a cultural stereotype thing? Like how everyone assumes Terrans only eat hamburgers and wear cowboy hats. Do you eat hamburgers and wear cowboy hats?" "I've been known to do both, though not simultaneously. The hat interferes with eating." Sarathis's smile revealed those fangs again, sharp and undeniable. "I do drink blood, yes, among other things. My species requires certain nutrients that your standard replicator food doesn't adequately provide. But we're quite civilized about it. Consent forms, medical screening, fair compensation, very bureaucratic. Nothing like the old stories where we'd sweep into villages and terrorize the locals." "That's actually kind of disappointing. I was expecting something more dramatic. Reality so rarely lives up to mythology. It's one of the universe's great failures." The orchestra transitioned into what Leon desperately hoped was the final movement of the waltz, a sweeping melody that somehow managed to sound both triumphant and vaguely ominous. His legs had begun operating on pure autopilot, following Sarathis's lead, while his conscious mind grappled with the fact that he was having a pleasant conversation with someone who could probably conquer his entire home system before breakfast. "I have to ask," Leon said, "why did you accept? When I asked you to dance, I mean. You could have said no. You could have had me thrown out an airlock. You had options." Sarathis considered this, her movements never faltering as they glided through a series of steps that Leon was fairly certain violated several laws of physics. "Curiosity, primarily. I've been attending these functions for longer than your species has had spaceflight, and they've become remarkably predictable. Everyone approaches me with such careful choreography, if they approach at all. Scripts written by diplomatic advisors, every word measured and weighed for potential offense. But you simply walked across the ballroom and asked me to dance, as if I were anyone else. In my defense, I didn't know you were you until about 2 minutes ago." "Yes, but you stayed even after you figured it out. That's the interesting part." She spun him again, and Leon caught a glimpse of the crowd. The Jovian minister had his hands clasped together as if witnessing something either miraculous or horrific. One of the Andromedan delegates had their suit cycling through colors that probably expressed extreme anxiety in their culture. Most people would have invented an excuse: sudden illness, emergency on their ship, diplomatic incident requiring immediate attention. "I did consider faking a heart attack," Leon admitted, "but I figured you'd probably know I was lying, and then I'd look stupid and cowardly instead of just stupid." A reasonable calculation. The music swelled around them, and Sarathis moved closer, her cool presence wrapping around Leon like a shadow. "You're also the first person in approximately 3 decades who's made me laugh. That's worth something. My commanding officer will be thrilled to know I've been diplomatically useful for once. Usually I just create incidents she has to apologize for." "What sort of incidents?" "Last month I accidentally insulted the Proxima ambassador by complimenting his ceremonial hat. Turns out it wasn't a hat, it was his spouse." Sarathis's eyes widened fractionally. His spouse was on his head? Their reproductive cycle is complicated. There was a very awkward debriefing afterward. Leon stumbled slightly, his exhausted legs finally beginning to fail, but Sarathis caught him with a subtle shift of weight that made it look intentional. "I also once started a trade dispute by ordering the wrong color of wine at a state dinner. Apparently green wine is a declaration of hostile intent in the Betelgeuse system. How did you resolve that?" "I drank all of it and passed out. They interpreted it as a peace offering through self-sacrifice. I woke up with a treaty and the worst hangover of my life." "Diplomacy through inadvertent sacrifice," Sarathis mused. "There's a certain elegance to that approach, even if it's completely unsustainable as policy." The final notes of the waltz began their descent, the orchestra somehow achieving something close to harmony. Leon's heart was pounding, though whether from exertion, terror, or the simple proximity to someone who radiated power like a contained star, He couldn't say. Serethis leaned closer, close enough that he could feel the absence of warmth from her skin, close enough that her hair brushed against his shoulder like silk woven from midnight. "Don't stop now," she murmured, her voice sliding into his ear with the inevitability of gravity. "You were brave enough to ask. Be brave enough to finish." Leon's laugh came out strangled, barely audible over the music. "Bravery implies I had any idea what I was getting into. This is more like aggressive ignorance leading to consequences. Same result, different motivation." Her breath, cool against his ear, carried a hint of something sweet and metallic that Leon's hindbrain identified as probably significant, but his forebrain was too overwhelmed to process. "Besides, we're almost done. One final turn, and you'll have successfully danced with the vampire queen of the Crimson Dominion without dying, fleeing, or causing an interstellar incident. That's quite an achievement. I'm putting it on my resume." "You absolutely should." They executed the final turn, a sweeping movement that brought them back to the center of the dance floor as the orchestra hit their concluding chord. The sound rang through the ballroom, followed by a moment of profound silence, where even the ambient hum of the station's life support seemed to pause. Leon and Serethis stood in the traditional closing position, her hand still in his other hand still at her waist, both of them frozen in the aftermath of the music, like statues carved from the moment itself. Then Serethis stepped back, releasing him with a grace that made the separation look like part of the choreography. Her smile had transformed from dangerous amusement to something warmer, more genuine, though the fangs remained prominently visible. "Thank you, Captain Cross," she said, her voice carrying across the silent ballroom with perfect clarity. "That was the most entertaining moment I've had in decades, possibly centuries. My memory gets imprecise after the first 500 years. Leon managed a bow that only wobbled slightly, his muscles screaming in protest. "Happy to provide entertainment. I do children's parties too, though I suspect your parties are significantly more sophisticated, less cake, more political maneuvering and existential dread. You'd be surprised. We have excellent cake." She produced something from within the folds of her gown, a movement so smooth Leon couldn't track where it had come from. A small crystalline card materialized in her palm, its surface swirling with captured starlight that seemed to move with its own internal logic. She pressed it into his hand, her cool fingers lingering against his for just a moment. "Should you ever find yourself in Dominion space, present this. You've earned a safe passage, and I'd be curious to see what other foolish things you might do." Leon stared at the card, its crystalline surface cool against his palm. The captured starlight within shifted and swirled in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if someone had folded three-dimensional space into a two-dimensional object and convinced it to stay that way through sheer force of will. He looked up to thank Serethis, or possibly ask what exactly foolish things might entail, but she was already moving away, gliding across the ballroom floor with that same impossible grace. The crowd parted before her like a sea that had suddenly remembered it had urgent business elsewhere. Leon stood alone in the center of the dance floor, his dress uniform soaked with sweat, his feet screaming in protest, and his brain still trying to process what had just happened. The silence held for another heartbeat. Then someone started clapping. The Jovian minister, his multiple hands coming together in a rhythm that sounded like applause or possibly ritualistic drumming. The sound broke whatever spell had settled over the ballroom, and suddenly everyone was applauding, a wave of noise that crashed over Leon from all directions. He wasn't sure if they were congratulating him on surviving or expressing relief that the entertainment had concluded without casualties. Possibly both. A waiter drone materialized at his elbow, offering a tray with a fresh glass of champagne. Leon took it with trembling hands and downed half of it in one gulp. It still tasted like regret fermented in starlight, but now it also tasted like victory. Or maybe that was just the adrenaline. "That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever witnessed," said a voice behind him. Leon turned to find Ambassador Takral, whose scent-based communication was currently expressing what Leon's translation implant helpfully identified as profound bewilderment mixed with grudging respect. The ambassador's three eyes blinked in sequence. I've been attending these functions for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone approach Queen Sarathis, let alone dance with her. Yeah, well, Leon said, finishing his champagne. I didn't know she was Queen Sarathis when I asked. I thought she was just someone who looked lonely and also terrifying. And when you discovered the truth? By then I was committed. Seemed rude to bail halfway through. Takral made a sound that Leon's implant translated as laughter, though it came out as a series of aromatic pulses that smelled like cinnamon and ozone. You Terrans have a remarkable capacity for stumbling into situations that should kill you and somehow emerging unscathed. It's almost admirable. Almost? It would be fully admirable if it seemed even slightly intentional. One of the Titan folk approached, her gravity boots leaving fresh cracks in the marble that the maintenance crew would definitely curse about. She was nearly 3 meters tall, built like a mobile fortress, and her expression suggested she was trying very hard not to smile. Captain Cross, yes? I am Constructor Val. I recorded your dance for the Titan Historical Archives. It will be studied by diplomatic scholars for generations as either a masterclass in bold negotiation or a cautionary tale about the dangers of acting without adequate intelligence. I'm voting for cautionary tale, Leon said. Feel free to add subtitles explaining all the mistakes. We will consider it. Val's smile finally broke through. Though I must admit, watching you realize who you were dancing with was the most genuine reaction I've seen at one of these galas. Usually everything is so carefully orchestrated. This was refreshingly chaotic. The Andromedian delegation drifted over, their suits now cycling through a pattern that Leon's implant suggested meant friendly curiosity. One of them extended a hand that had 3 too many fingers. We would like to know your secret, Captain. How did you overcome your fear? I didn't overcome it, Leon said, shaking the offered hand carefully. I just decided being terrified while standing still was worse than being terrified while dancing. At least dancing gave me something to focus on besides my impending doom. Practical philosophy, the Andromedian said, their suit brightening with what might have been approval. We respect this approach. More people approached. Delegates, ambassadors, officials whose titles Leon couldn't begin to remember. They all wanted to know about the dance, about Queen Sarathis, about what she'd said and how she'd moved, and whether Leon had noticed the way the light seemed to bend around her. He answered as best he could, leaving out the parts about his near panic and the certainty that he was going to die. No need to ruin the story with excessive honesty. After 20 minutes of impromptu celebrity that he absolutely hadn't asked for, Leon managed to extract himself from the crowd. He made his way back to his original position near the refreshment table, where he acquired another glass of terrible champagne and tried to pretend his hands weren't still shaking. Lieutenant Rivera was going to kill him. His commanding officer was going to kill him. Hell, once word got back to Terran Federation Command, they'd probably kill him, resurrect him, and kill him again just to make sure the lesson stuck. He'd danced with Queen Sarathis without clearance, without briefing, without any of the 17,000 protocols that definitely existed for exactly the situation. But he'd also made her laugh. He'd had a genuine conversation with someone who'd been alive for centuries, someone who probably viewed most interactions as tedious performances. And he'd walked away with a safe passage card that was currently burning a hole in his pocket through sheer metaphysical weight. The crystalline card felt warm now, or maybe that was just his imagination. Leon pulled it out and studied it again. The swirling starlight had settled into a pattern that almost looked like a constellation, though not one he recognized. On the back, in script so fine it might have been written with laser precision, were coordinates. Just coordinates, no explanation, no context. An invitation or a test, or possibly both. The gala continued around him, the earlier tension dissipating as people returned to their networking and politicking. The orchestra had moved on to something that sounded like a Procyon folk melody crossed with a mathematical equation. The Jovian minister was arguing about tariff regulations again. The service drones resumed their careful choreography of drink delivery and canapé circulation. Everything returned to normal, or what passed for normal at a diplomatic function involving 100 different species with 100 different ideas about appropriate social behavior. Leon tucked the card back into his pocket and checked his chronometer. Another 2 hours until the gala officially ended and he could escape back to his ship. 2 hours of small talk and forced socialization and pretending he hadn't just done something spectacularly stupid that had somehow worked out. But as he stood there, watching the crowd swirl and eddy around the ballroom, Leon realized something had shifted. The gala didn't seem quite as unbearable anymore. The conversation didn't feel as forced. He'd done the impossible, not by being careful or following protocols or doing anything remotely sensible, but by being himself. The end.